Thank you for joining us today. This is Bill Baker with Firestorm. We're located right here in Georgia, and we're delighted to be able to have a chat today with our good friends at the Georgia Independent School Association and our friends here in our home state. Today we're talking about take a good look at yourself. This is part of working with our intelligence network. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series, number 7 in the 2015 series that is sponsored by the Georgia Independent School Association. Our presenter today is Jim Satterfield, president of Firestorm, and he will be joining us shortly. I'd like to remind you that you can become our friend. Facebook, Firestorm Solutions. Twitter, Firestorm Soul. Hashtag Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We'd like to remind you, though, that the presentation today is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product that we discuss must be read and considered in accordance with your organization's personal counsel. This information should not be considered legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is pleased that we have a good relationship with the Georgia Independent School Association. They've been the host and the underwriter of this Crisis Coach webinar series. If you want to watch previous presentations in this series, go to firestorm.com. You can watch past webinars. You can also register for future webinars. We have them about once a month. Jeff Jackson.
And so I'll step in.
Go ahead,
I'll
Jim.
step in for Jeff. I don't think Jeff's with us at this point, but we will. He would be welcoming you and reminding you of upcoming events. There is a workshop on September the 24th. I believe it's the 24th. Let me just confirm that to that date with the Georgia Independent School Association, and it's a chance to participate in an exercise, learn more about crisis communications, have peer meetings with your counterparts, and work through that. In fact, I gave you the wrong date, everyone. It is the September the 22nd, and if you need details, you can contact the GISA office, and it's a good opportunity for you to look at your plans and see where they are. I'm Jim Satterfield, and Bill, thanks for doing the lead-in and introduction today as we focus on where we're trying to go. Now, in July and August, we had emphasized the intelligence network and listening and looking what's out there and trying to focus around learning about how do you know what you don't know. And if you look at the chart that's on the screen right now, when we're looking at our school, there's a lot that we do know. We know where we're located. We know the geographic aspects around that, with the types of weather risks that we might face. Obviously, coastal Georgia is a little different than North Georgia as we do our plans and focusing in those areas. We also know what we don't know, and we don't know necessarily the exact time that something is going to happen, or that we've got to go back and fill this gap that we have within it. But the biggest portion of this is what we don't know, you don't know. And so when you think about that, as you look at this, this is an area that we want to help today in, to start to round out all of the plans that you've been working on within your school. And we're going to give you some tools and some frameworks to think about that as we move forward today in making sure that you can start to eliminate that big orange section. When you report to school for kindergarten, there's a lot you don't know. There's even more that you don't even know what it is you don't know. Hopefully when you graduate as a senior and you move on to college with the rest of your life, you begin to shorten that gap. But life learning is a lifelong challenge for all of us. And as we think about disasters and crises and the types of events that can impact us at school, that becomes an opportunity for us to work together. So how do we do all of that? So let's start to lay out plans and think about it in this format, and we'll talk about the predict, plan, perform more in just a few minutes. But if you think about, one place to start is to look at your plans. How do they align to standards and best practices? Underwritten by the Georgia Independent School Association is the ability for you to get a self-assessment of where your plans are relative to standards and best practices, and the cost of that is being underwritten by your membership in GISA. I would encourage you, if you haven't done that, to take advantage of it, and it's a good place to start. The next level up would be more of a detailed analysis, where instead of your opinion in the self-assessment, looking at the hard plans, doing a gap analysis and knowing specifically this needs to be added or that needs to be added, or here's an area that we haven't addressed associated with it. Then completing a risk analysis, and we'll give you some tools today, again, around looking at the risk analysis, understanding what types of things could occur, and we'll give you a framework to organize your thoughts and a specific tool that you can use today to go back and sit with your organization. As you think also about what are the impacts if we had to close school for a period of time, how will we do that? Will we have to refund tuition? What are the elements that go into those impacts? What are we dependent on? Who are our external dependencies? Who are our internal dependencies? What are the specific impacts that would be occurring? And the term of art for that is called a business impact analysis. Then what are the strategies? What if this happens, what is it we thinking about doing? And then we move that just from being a strategy, talking about what, to being a plan. That's the how you're going to do it. And that will determine, are your plans actionable? And that's clearly the goal that everyone wants to have, is an actionable plan. Then the crisis communications. What are we going to say to parents? What are we going to say to our students and to our teachers? What do we have to say to our alumni, to our donors, to the accreditation people, or in some cases to DFACs if this is something that's happening to our children, or to the police if it's an event that would escalate in those areas. Then the training and awareness, and we're going to give you some tools today to thinking about how everyone can be aware of where you are and what needs to be done next. And then testing your plans and going through exercises, and this is more than a fire drill or more than even an armed intruder drill, in looking at the types of exposures that we would have. And then we have to keep our plans updated and keep them maintained as we have turnover and changes or new threats start to come into the organization. And so putting it in that framework, this is a continuous improvement process. Just as you would lay out the school year from an academic and a curriculum standpoint, you want to lay out your planning to follow what do we want to accomplish by each one of these steps along the way. So if we stop for a minute, creating an intelligence network, and if you missed those webinars, you can go back and see them on the Firestorm site. I believe if we didn't do webinars in July and August for GISA, but you can go and listen to the RenWeb webinars that were recorded for those 2 months, and that will fill that gap. So I want you to think about intelligence as knowing before now. When do you want to know something? You don't want to wait and be surprised by that event. You'd like to know it as soon as you can. Any notice that you can give, are you going to shelter in place? Are you going to go to lockout or lockdown, or do you need to evacuate? Understanding those as early as you can gives you more options. As the event becomes closer, as it becomes of more intensity, it becomes much more critical associated to what you can and cannot do within your school. So can you identify your school's next crisis? And the important element in doing the planning, as we're talking about taking a look at your school and your plans, is you have to do that. You must be able to do it, and you must be able to think about your plans in the perspective of predict, plan, perform. And we're going to go into that a little bit more, and then we're going to start to peel this onion back, giving you some specific things to accomplish at each one of those 3 areas as we go through it. When you think about it, your intelligence network is the foundation in which you're going to build your plans, test your plans, and then finally execute when you must in responding. So we talk about predict, plan, perform. What does that methodology really relate to? The PREDICT is fairly straightforward. What are the vulnerabilities, the threats, the risks that we face as a school? What would be our impacts on us in every aspect of our school if that in fact occurred? How do we monitor to see if each one of those threats are starting to emerge or escalate? And then what's the trigger point? How bad does it get before we activate our plan, before we take those steps? So the predictive work becomes the foundation that you're going to build the plan on within your school. Having that established, having the intelligence network, having all of those things in place makes a difference in terms of outcome. The plans then become, what do we need at our school? Do we need an emergency plan? Clearly you need to do that. Do we need a crisis plan? How we make decisions in a crisis? Who will be responsible for that? Having a program that deal with behaviors of concern, the Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment Program, acronym for that is BERTHA. If you can identify that behavior of concern before it escalates to a threat, before it escalates to violence, it's going to make a significant difference. Do you have a communicable illness plan? We've seen a school already in North Carolina this year with an intestinal flu that ran through the school and drove absenteeism extremely high. We're dealing this morning with a SARS outbreak outside of the United States that is starting to have some particular impacts. This summer, we dealt with a measles outbreak at a camp as it would go through. So it doesn't have to be a global pandemic to have an impact. The worst disaster that you'll ever see is one that affects you, your school, or your students. And so planning in each of those areas, and then physical security and cyber security, the information, the data that you have, all of those areas come together in the plan function. The perform, that's the training, the testing of your plans, making sure you have all the emergency supplies, that you're maintaining the monitoring of your intelligence network, and then your ability to make decisions in a crisis, your crisis management skills that come together associated with that. Now, last month we did a virtual exercise, and we had hundreds of organizations that participated. We did one for businesses and a different one for schools, and each one of the groups that participated had their team around their conference table or in a classroom listening and then making the decisions about what they knew and what they were concerned about and what their plans were and what they were going to monitor and what they were going to communicate. If you missed joining in on that virtual exercise, the next time one is scheduled, I would encourage you to do it. It's a great opportunity to have your team learn in a crisis environment that's safe, but yet they begin to see how the elements of the plan come together. So if you think about this as a beginning, well, where do you go from there? Well, what's next? Monitoring and having an intelligence network is great. You need that. But it's not the only answer. We then need to make sure that everyone in the school, everyone in the leadership understands that. They need to understand what that program does and what it doesn't do. Once it's understood, you need to be talking about it, document it, and then categorizing that with specific activities that you're going to take once you see these things starting to emerge. If you saw that there was bullying going on in your school, wouldn't you want to intervene? Does it have to be bullying that happens on the school grounds, or if it's occurring over the internet? If you see hazing going on, if you see sexual molestation, if you see any of those elements, those are opportunities for us to make a difference and to have an action that would help us as we deal with those elements within our school. Today, and I'll talk about this again later, but I want to emphasize it right now. If someone has ill intent to themselves or others, 80% of the time somebody else knows. 80%. So if you had someone that was a cutter or thinking about suicide or had anger directed at another party, someone knows besides that particular individual. And 67% of the time, 2 out of 3 times, 2 or more people know, and when they know, they talk. And where do people talk today? It's on social media. That's why the intelligence network becomes so very, very critical. But this needs to be a part of who you are. It needs to be discussed and understood and have a documented flow process by which you deal with that information. So what are the activities that you need to take place and do? And we think about our school, we've got to think about the school itself. Do our external doors lock? Do our classroom doors have locks associated with them? Are they kept locked during the school day? We think about each building or location or the campus. We think about our students, teachers, employees, administration. How do we communicate with the families? How do we deal with visitors on our school campus? How do we carry that through? And so it's starting to introduce this discussion around awareness. What should you be aware of? When do we communicate? What are the specific communication points that we start to escalate that level of communication and help us to respond and take the actions that need to be dealt with? What are the intervention procedures? If we have identified that behavior of concern, what do we do? When do we know that that behavior of concern has been dealt with and de-escalated? What's the process by which we would evaluate that behavior for readmission to school? Who signs off on it? What are those elements that go into place? How do we notify people? Notify instantly in the school? Is that a paging system? Is it bells? Do we have notices that we send to parents by automatic notification systems? Is it text? Is it email? Is it voice? How do we get that information out? And then what's the decision process and who's involved in it? So those are all the types of activities that we now need to start to discuss and document and communicate if we are going to have our intelligence network to be more than just something over here on the side, to become an integral part. Now, as we think about our school, we have to think about it not only as school, where education and our mission and creating the environment for learning becomes very important. There are some common failures that we see repeated over and over in a disaster or a crisis. They're listed on the screen. The largest failure in a disaster or a crisis is the failure to control critical supply chains. Who are your critical vendors? What's your backup plan? You already have a backup plan. If a teacher calls in sick, you have substitute teachers. You have someone that can step in and fill and cover that class. But what if something were to happen to our building? What would happen if we have a cleaning company? And do they have plans that they can come in and back up if they have a particular problem? Or food services? Who are the other vendors that we rely on? And how sure are we of their individual plans? The statistics on the second one, training employees for work and at home, across the board, 70% of employees in schools and businesses don't know what they're supposed to do in a disaster or a crisis. 70%. So you're already limited in your ability to respond to that, with only 30% clearly understanding what it is they should specifically do if these events start to happen. And 95% don't have a disaster plan at home. Family trumps job. If you don't have a plan at home and there's an event that's affecting your area, then you're forcing families and teachers to choose between their job and their family, and family trumps job. You can go to our website and download the book Disaster Ready People for Disaster Ready America, and that's about doing a plan at home. Or you can get hard copies of the book and even have it printed with your plan in it. And by the way, it's a fundraiser opportunity that you could implement at the school. But having everyone aware and thinking about these things makes a real difference. Fourth is compare to conduct exercises and update plans. The majority of plans aren't tested thoroughly all the way through. Now, obviously, you do fire drills on a regular basis. Some of you do armed intruder drills. Are you doing an armed intruder drill with people on the sports field? And how do they react, and where do they go, and what do they need to do at that point? Are you dealing with other types of threats and risk and exposures? Have you looked at your decision processes and who would be in charge and how you would communicate? So laying out a calendar, just like you lay out a curriculum spread over the course of a year, becomes very important as you test your plans and make sure they're updated. Also, as you have turnover, you need to be at least 3 deep at every position. That's HR Rule 1, 2, 3. So a teacher can't do two things. They can only do one thing in a crisis. So if they're not available, who's going to fill in and do that role? And last is have a crisis communications plan. Take all those vulnerabilities and threats and risk and identify those and say, what would we communicate at each stage of this process to our parents, to our students, to our teachers, to our other stakeholders? What role do we play in each of those? How do we communicate? What's the medium we communicate? So you take each risk, what's the message to each one of the stakeholder groups? So this is a complex process, and you need to, that's exactly where you would start. And you do that by following the predict, plan, perform that we've been discussing. And then you'd look at how you identify and involve everything that you see on the screen, conducting the exercises, the what if this happens, what would we do, and then establish how you'd monitor and how you'd communicate. Now, as we think through this, there's another framework that I want to establish. We started out thinking about the intelligence network and the activities, and then where you start and looking at these 5 specific exposures that we sort of see repeated in every disaster and crisis. But we have to figure out where we are at each stage of a crisis and the escalation that occurs. Now, if you look at this, it shows you that this is the basis where all our plans start to come together. Now, pre-action is the time where nothing is occurring. It's attending a webinar today to learn more about what you need to do. It's training your teachers, training your students. It's coordinating with the local fire and police. It's having your plans reviewed and assessed and updated and made available. Getting the supplies put into place, and all of those events coming together. Now, if you have the crisis, if you have the disaster, if you have the event that occurs, you're going to be immediately focused in onset on life and safety. That's your primary driving force. That's where your emergency plans come in, the standard protocol with shelter in place, lockout, lockdown, evacuate. Very clear actions, how that's communicated, what's the message, what are the actions that you want to see taken place at that point in time. But now as that action goes on, we have to determine how bad is it. And so there will be 2 levels of impact assessment. One is an initial high level, and then if it looks severe, then the more detailed understanding what is this going to do to our ability to teach, our ability to have school and carry our business forward. The exercise we did last month for the schools was one in which there was a lightning strike on the sports field. We had 3 students who went down. There was then a little tornado that hit the building and created damage. As that carried through, you had different decisions to make and different communications and restrictions. So the impact assessment from a rainstorm is completely different than the impact assessment associated to that tornado strike. So planning and looking through at every element. Then if it is severe and there's a significant impact on our students or our teachers or on our building and facilities, we're going to declare a crisis. That's where your crisis management plan would come in. The emergency response area is very tactical. The crisis is managing the brand and the reputation in each of those areas. And so there's key decisions that have to be made by the senior leadership of the school and ultimately the board. And then as we respond to the crisis, if we have to have a problem here, how do we respond to it and how do we recover? How are we going to have class tomorrow? Where are we going to have class tomorrow if there's something that happened to our building? Do we have a remote learning opportunity put into place? And so as we think of each of those are more of the classic business continuity or continuity planning areas. Then afterwards we'll be focused on the recovery. What's our process to review it, to do the hot wash, to have the lessons learned on how we can go about and improve our plans. So as we look at these 5 stages, there's an activation metrics of identifying and anticipating the threats. How do we establish the intelligence team that's going to be monitoring those to get that information so that we know this threat is now occurring, we need to take these actions in place to start to protect our school and our ability to operate as a business. Identify this HR rule 1, 2, 3. Who's the primary? Who's the backup? Because we have to be 3 deep at every critical position. Documenting the actions that we will take. If this occurs, we're going to do that. If something else occurs, we're going to do this other thing. And then as you document all of these criteria, the response procedures, the messaging, all of those elements need to come together to be in place. So, because at a crisis, we're going to be focused on time and access. Time, the sooner we know, the ability to get it done, and then access to whatever we need in order to be able to implement our plans. And we've got some tools that will help with that, and let's spend a couple of minutes talking about those in our discussion today. So we focus first on the impact. Now, if you look at the little grid at the top of the slide, it identifies, you'd identify the event, then you'd look at the probability. Is this likely? Is it highly likely? The onset speed, how quickly will it happen? We would learn about a tornado with only a short period of time. If you're in a coastal location, you might get notice of a hurricane days or weeks in advance. Forewarning, the duration, how long will it last, how intense will it be, and then we want to stop and look at the human impact, the property impact, the business impact, and then the total impact on the school. We then combine all of those numbers together to get a relative risk indicator. And so those that have the highest numbers would certainly be the ones that we'd want to make sure that we'd address. Now, even a low probability number could occur, but we're not going to spend as much time on focusing on that aspect as we will those that are higher. Now, as you go through and think about all the risks and threats and vulnerabilities that are present in your school, it helps to break that into some big buckets. First, those are the natural hazards that could be out there. I live in Roswell, Georgia, so we could have winter storms, we can have tornado, we could have hail. There are flooding in some areas. Right along the Chattahoochee, it's going to certainly flood as those elements would come in. So you'd list all of those and then go across and complete this matrix. Then think about it from a biological standpoint. Is there hazardous materials? Could there be an accident on the expressway with a spill? Communicable illness. What's the vaccination rate within our school? By the way, if you have an exchange program and you have students that come in from out of the country as a part of your school, do they have the same vaccination requirements in their country as you have here in the United States? And do you have an exposure? We dealt with some young people who came in from Ireland over the summer who hadn't had vaccinations and brought a measles outbreak into a camp. So you want to think about the biological exposures. The technological, if you're thinking about cyber breach and risk, look at all the information you have about the families that are in students enrolled in your school, and identity theft and loss of personal health information. The exposures that we see in those areas certainly aren't decreasing, they're only increasing. And then finally, the human-induced hazards. This could be violence, it's the bullying, it's the sexual molestation. It could be the accident that occurs as a result of that. I saw a show on television yesterday where they were catching people speeding in 50 mile an hour in a school zone at the time the school was opening in the morning. So clearly there are human-induced hazards. So you list those, rank them, and start to do their plans. Well, how do I know when to activate my plan? The grid that you see down below was designed for a particular company, and as they were concerned about their suppliers or their environmental or their property, you would list your own grid along that left-hand column, and you can divide it into 3 categories. Category 1 being the low, Category 2 being a little bit more of a moderate or an incident, defining who's going to be responsible, and then a Category 3 escalates up that you're going to have the senior leadership of the school involved in that. It's a crisis at this point in time, and so stepping into those areas becomes important. But everyone in school could have this single sheet so they could look at what they're seeing and then make a determination of who they should escalate this to, who's going to be responsible in making those decisions as we come together. Now, there's another way to put it, and you'll see we took those same 3 levels in this illustration and saying, look, the level 1 is the lowest level. That's where the teacher handles it, or the on-site emergency response team would come in. The incident response team is an escalation. It's going to be a bigger event, more impacted. And then finally something that if it's a crisis level, then we're going to get the crisis management team, and then we've got to coordinate with other personnel, and ultimately your board. Your board has a fiduciary and a governance responsibility to make sure that our school is safe, that the environment is in place to protect everyone within it. But we want to also start to go beyond that, and that even has an application in our school, to think of our school as a business. And so as we think about the direction of where we are going from a preparedness or security or safety standpoint, the future of that is in looking at the structure, the operational and functional processes within it. How do we protect our people, our profitability, our brand, our reputation? If we had to close because of a communicable illness, are we going to refund all the tuition? How do we meet our obligations in each of these individual areas? And our goal is to identify the risk before they occur. This before now concept becomes extremely important. I've shared with you on many occasions that I say that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it was my birthday. Here's an opportunity to make sure that we can identify these with our intelligence network, with the steps that we need to take place before it becomes critical. So understanding before now is the goal that we all have. So there's embedded risk, and we know about some of the risks from the environment or from violence, but let's think about within our organization, the communication of information and how our senior leadership responds. We were involved with a school where there were behaviors of concern, and some decisions were made that were suboptimal, and as a result of that, it escalated the problem and led to that change within the school because of the way the decisions were made. Operational, how does the school handle the basic communications processes that go on within it? How do you handle the business processes that need to be dealt with? And finally, functional, is the information available here but not there? Is it something the coaches know, but yet the leadership of the school doesn't know? Information in some schools can be used as a weapon because it's seen as a power base in being communicated. So if we're trying to take our intelligence network to a higher level, what are the things that we do associated with it? Why is all of this important? Because most of these crises can be foreseen. There are indicators that are out there. In the areas of behavior, there are indicators of those behaviors that are precursors that we carry forward. If someone has suicidal tendencies, we're seeing it usually in a school environment that there is a kill list associated with that, and we can identify those behaviors earlier. Cutting could be a precursor to a suicide concern. So now we're starting to go back and to see what's being said, by whom, and when do we take those actions to come forward. So if we can identify these risks early, it empowers the leadership of the school to avoid or mitigate these impacts as they start to occur. Now, when we think about crisis, there's different levels of complexity. Most everything you've done from a planning point in a school is looked at a very targeted crisis. The tornado, the fire, the armed intruder. It's not going to tie the entire organization up. It's a very defined exposure, and it's generally tending to be more tactical and more emergency oriented. But there's some things that become much more complex, and particularly how we react to them, how we deal with them. I cited data breach as a particular aspect. If suddenly the financial information of your parents was lost due to a breach in your IT system, that would be an exposure. How you responded to the crisis that was identified up above could well trigger a second. We were involved in a school where they made a decision to readmit a student but didn't go through a formal process, and later that triggered a media event around it. So there's a lot of exposure that can come back in to make this simple crisis much more targeted. This targeted crisis much more complex. I said that backwards. So if we think about our time to react, that's the other element that we look at. If it's a targeted event, it's just focused on that particular area. If suddenly it becomes much more of an extreme urgency, the time to act when the tornado siren sounds is now, not later. We don't have the luxury of time. Other things like the weather forecast of what's going to be happening for Friday night's game, we have many days to be ready and be prepared in that particular point of time. So this comes back to this diagnostic model, and we've shown this to you in other of our webinars, but I wanted to point out it's a different way of thinking about the risk. Most of the planning work that your plans in your school have done are in that blue quadrant. That's the acute crisis that's coming in, the weather event, the active shooter. Speed is quality of response. So it's targeted and it's extremely urgent. But there are underlying difficulties that come in the other three quadrants. Starts out as a difficult process. There's some lack of controls, failure to communicate. There are not good metrics or process controls in places. It becomes chronic. It's now systemic within it. It continues to escalate. It would then become a severe problem. Is your enrollment maintaining steady? Is your enrollment declining? Did you meet your projections for fall enrollment within the school? If you didn't, that could be starting to be a difficult problem because now we're not going to have the funding to give the raises that we want to give or to maintain the quality of education that we want to have in place or to have the ability to buy the supplies and respond into the areas that we need to within our school. So what I would encourage you to do is to think about enrollment as an indicator of an underlying problem within the school. Maybe it's a quality problem. Maybe it's a way that students are treated or perceived within that school. It becomes a critical element. If you don't address it early, then it's going to be a chronic. You know, our enrollment was down last year, it's now down again, or we're getting people withdrawing in the middle of the school year. This becomes a business crisis for the school. And this is a role for you on the call to be able to say, what are the indicators that we can see and determine so we can take action before it's a death spiral. We were involved with a school last year where the funding became a particular issue, and the money that was held for later to pay those teachers over the summer was no longer available to help that school. They had a financial crisis that was coming in to directly impact that particular school. And so as you look at the lack of processes and procedures, what started as a difficult situation became chronic because they were robbing Peter to pay Paul, and then finally it became a severe crisis to determine even the survivability of the school associated with it. So we have to learn to think about this in an escalated manner. So as we think about the intelligent strategy of taking a good look at it, we want to act before now, and so this is a much more dynamic risk process. What are we would do the audits, where are we financially, where are we operationally? Your board has an audit committee. They probably play a role in helping and supporting management. The indication of training there to say we need to know if we start to see these things happen, they could be symptomatic of other problems within our school. Certainly physical security is an element. The social media intelligence, we're finding that we have problems in our school from monitoring social media. Remember those statistics that I told you earlier, that 80% of the time someone else knows, and 67% of the time 2 or more people know. And when we see those postings starting to appear and being commented on, that becomes a driver. We see pictures of guns in classrooms or stories about that, or indications that someone is having a problem at home or having a problem with a particular teacher. Those can all be the start of having a dynamic risk process. And then understanding those indicators to activate your plan makes a real difference at each step along the way. And then finally, communicating. We don't want to get information siloed. We don't want to get it trapped in a particular area, and letting them know what you need them to do at each step along the way. So the predict, plan, perform methodology that we've talked about, understanding the risk, developing the plans, the processes, testing it, making sure you have the supplies and the materials, that you are in fact doing the monitoring, That will make a difference to bring your plans in line with standards and best practices. So let's kind of sum up where we are. We're all concerned about if this happens, what will we do? And the key is going to be to have warning, to understand now, before the events occur, before now, what we need to do. So if we're going to, let's take a step back. Let's think about what the consequence of some of these events happening. If they're minor, we don't have to spend much time associated with it. But if it is major, if we're measuring the consequence associated with that, then we have to do everything we can to either prevent or mitigate that from occurring. And then responding appropriately as quickly as we can as we look at the impacts associated with our school. We divide things between strategic and tactical. Tactical would be the lockdown, the lockout, the shelter in place, the evacuate. Those physical actions that we can take and carry forward. Strategic will then be, what will be the implication of this on the financial position of the school, on the brand, the reputation? Is this going to be an escalation? We were dealing with a school out of state, and they had had a problem with the head of school who had inappropriate contact with teachers and with candidates who were interviewing for jobs. And as it turns out, there were 8 different complainants that came forward. Well, the impact on that school could be disproportional if that information becomes widely shared and known. You can't let that go and not address it and take the appropriate action. We found child pornography in another school on an official in the school's computer. That's an environment that could certainly have strategic impact associated with it. Multiple related incidents in a single school year can have a significant impact, and if they're clearly linked together, showing a pattern of failure to identify and respond appropriately, can have a disproportional impact on our school. So identifying the business crisis risk, is this an operational, financial risk to the school in addition to the physical security types of threats, becomes very critical. Having an intelligence network, monitoring, understanding the triggers, and taking access to be able to respond. And this instant access tools, today, instead of having a plan on a binder on a shelf somewhere, you have the ability to put the plan in the palm of your hand. Smartphones and devices, that instant access tool is what we're referring to with the IT there. You could have the emergency plan on the smartphone of the teacher, so that if the notice came out, she could look on her phone and it would tell her exactly what needed to be done. Those tools are now available at a cost that's manageable even for the smallest school. So having your plans accessible to the people as they need them, that's where standards and best practices have gone. You can participate and learn how your team will respond. The next time we do a virtual exercise, I would encourage you to have your team sitting around the table talking about what they would do in each step that way, or planning an exercise that you would carry forward. You want to align your plans to standards and best practices. If you haven't done the self-assessment, I would encourage you to do so. Create your own intelligence network. You can start small and start to build larger, but have a system in place, because the earlier you know about an impending threat, the better you're going to be able to perform. Or schedule training. Again, there is a workshop in Georgia on the 22nd of September. Check with the GISA office on the details, but there's a good opportunity. Our thanks to the Georgia Independent School Association for underwriting this webinar series, and we look forward to sharing with you each month some other aspect of how this process is done and carried forward. If you have questions, you can contact us at firestorm.com. By going to our website, there's a contact form there, or you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or call us at 800-321-2219. There's a lot to think about. We've got to take a good look at ourselves and our school and our plans to understand, are we ready? Are you sure? How do you know? Those are the underlying questions that we need to address, and I encourage you to make sure that you've addressed those for your school as we come together. We will have another conversation next month as we look at a new topic and continue this webinar series. Have a wonderful school year, and I look forward to our conversation next month. Thanks, and goodbye.